All right, well, now we are on our second video on how to build your biblical framework for a church. The first video we just did was looking at the issue of the word ecclesia or church. And that's the first part of our framework, is we just really need to understand how that word is used, both in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament. Specifically in the New Testament, what is the church? But now what we're going to do is we're going to shift, and we're going to now look at the second aspect of building your biblical framework. And we're going to look at metaphors for the word church. So let me go ahead and share my screen again. And as we do that, this is our second way that we are adding to our framework by looking at the use of metaphors for the word church. So just by way of reminder, I want us to understand clearly what a metaphor is. So a metaphor is a device, a literary device, that uses an implied comparison between two unlike things to explain something, right? Jesus says that the Lord is my shepherd, right? So he is describing himself that as God, he's like a shepherd. God is not a shepherd, but he is like a shepherd, and he does the things that a shepherd would do. And so we're going to look at a number of metaphors here. And when we look at these metaphors, what we are not going to do is come to any conclusions as to how they contribute to the church. That is something I want you to do in this exercise. And again, what I would recommend is that you do this as a cohort, you divide and conquer. But I will give you a number of metaphors to begin to think about. So the first metaphor we see is the church as the body of Christ, that the church is very clearly seen as a body. And so you want to ask yourself, as you're trying to think through this framework that you want to create, is how does this metaphor contribute to your understanding of the nature of the church? And you're going to want to do that for every one of the metaphors. And as you do that, you will be adding another aspect to your framework. So the first metaphor is the church as the body of Christ. The second metaphor that we find in the church, and you can see the verses listed there, is the church is the temple of God. And so again, we're trying to understand is, why does God give us this metaphor that the church is like the temple of God, as the temple of God? And so you'll want to say, what does this contribute to my understanding of the church? And to do that, obviously, you're going to then have to understand, what was the temple? What was it used for? How did the priests interact? Why did God have a tabernacle and a temple? And what were their purposes? The next metaphor is the church as a priesthood, right? And we see this in 1 Peter, is that the church is described as a priesthood. And so we want to understand that metaphor. Why would God use the metaphor of a priesthood? And how does that help us to understand the nature of the church? Another metaphor is the church as the bride of Christ. And as we think about marriage, and as we think about a bride and how beautiful she is on that day, and we want to be thinking, why does God use that kind of a metaphor where he is the groom, the church is the bride? What is he driving at? And how does that metaphor contribute to your understanding of the church? The next metaphor is the church is the people of God. And as you can see, I love this picture on the left because it's made up of people. And they form this thing called a church. Whether your church looks like that or not, doesn't really matter. But why does God use the church as a people of God? What is in that metaphor that helps us understand the nature of the church? Another one is the church is the flock of God. And you need to understand, okay, what does it mean to be a sheep? And what does a flock of sheep do? And based on that, why would God use a flock of sheep metaphor to actually help us to understand the nature of his church? And that will help you to also build your framework. The church is the branches of the vine, right? In John 15, 1-7, John describes that Christ is the branch and that we're the fruit on that branch. And why does he use this metaphor of the branches of the vine? The church is one new man, okay? That we have the Jew and the Gentile coming together, forming one new man. How does this metaphor help us to understand the nature and the function of the church? The church is the family of God, right? It's not a Western thing. It's not an Eastern thing. It's not an African thing. It's a global thing that Jesus wanted for every person, right? Starts in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the outermost parts of the world. And so the metaphor of the church is the family of God. How does that help us to understand, again, the nature and function of the church? And the church as God's mission to the world. Okay, and this will be our last one. The church as God's mission to the world. How does that metaphor begin to help us to understand the nature of the church, the function of the church, why God created the church? And as we get all these metaphors, as we begin to get more and more understanding, again, we want to begin to think, okay, well, how does it help me to construct this framework that I'm going to use to evaluate my church? Because I'm going to have to make an assessment tool out of this framework. And so be thinking, how do these things relate to the assessment tool that I'm going to make, and really how our church functions? And there you have it. This is the second part that we're looking at in terms of how to build your biblical framework. In a minute, we'll start a third video once you've gone through this. Thanks.